Morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.
You know, it's on a Wednesday morning. We do talk HR with HRMAB, one of my favorite segments. I think by now you've figured this all out. And today we want to take a look at employment contracts, legal and psychological. I can hear some of you say, psychological? We'll clarify that for you in just a moment. But I believe I've watched sufficient, legal TV, and I have a broad understanding of what a contract is. But is having a broad understanding of what a contract is enough in the workplace? And so we want to be able to look at all of that in just a moment right here as we talk HR with HRMAB. And joining us to talk about this and much more is Joan Underwood, who is the president of HRMAB. With her is this lady right there, Michelle Lewis Downer, a business psychologist. Michelle, good morning to you.
Good morning to you, Pearson. How are you?
I am doing well. Thank you for asking. How do you do?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Help me understand, first of all, what is a business psychologist?
Oh my goodness, I knew you were going to ask me that. Essentially, that's concerned with behaviours in the workplace. So why do people behave in a certain way? What impacts people's behaviours in the way that they work and their attitude and behaviours in the place of work? And then when you're looking at perhaps selection, assessment, talent management, talent development, selecting people, hand in glove with recruitment, are there things that we can put in place in the vetting process to predict perhaps how people might behave in a role going forward? So a few things.
So you know in just a moment, but let me introduce you now to the president of HRMAB, my friend Joan Underwood. Joan, good morning.
Good morning, Pearson.
Good to see you. Today we're talking employment contracts. Now, I've watched enough of Judge Judy to know that she will tell you that what forms the four corners of this piece of paper is the contract. And, is that enough? So what should one expect within the four corners of that piece of paper known as a contract?
Well, fortunately for us here in Barbados, the legislators have figured that out for us. What do I mean by that? The Employment Right Act tells you exactly what it is you need to include in that employment contract. That's the legal contract. So you need to stipulate things like the place of work, the hours of work, rate of remuneration, pay periods, all the parameters that an incoming employee needs to know in order to be able to meet your expectations as an employer. So that's the legal contract. That's on the paper that Judge Judy talks about. However, that's not the only contract. So that's an express contract in that the terms and conditions are written. And if there is to be a variation on any of those terms, that too has to be done in writing so that both parties are always on the same page in terms of rights and responsibilities. Having said that, there is an implied component to contract when we are dealing with employment. And that's where the psychological contract comes into play.
And I'm going to come to that in a second, So there's the written contract, but we oftentimes hear of the verbal contract. Once there's an offer and acceptance, we have a contract, folks. Is it that simple? And in instances where it is, yeah, Joan, you can come work for me. I'll pay you every Friday $150, and you turn up for work Monday to Friday, 8 to 4. Is that sufficient today?
No, it is not according to the law. You see, and it's important to understand that it's not something that's nice to have. The written contract is a legal requirement. So yes, you're going to have the conversation in the interview process, in the selection process, you're going to talk about what the terms and conditions are. But again, the Employment Rights Act stipulates that employers must provide a written contract to employees. And this is for the protection of both parties. Because we can, when we're in the honeymoon phase or in the courting phase where I like you, you think you like me, it's all sunshine and roses. And so we think we have an agreement. And then we get into the relationship and the tension builds up. And then my recollection of what we agreed to may be different than yours. So having the written contract safeguards the interests of both parties. And it's a legal requirement.
That's it. It's a legal requirement. So while we can talk, that honeymoon, that courting, that courtship can be talk, but once we get down to the marriage, it has to be legalized. It has to be written as well. And this is where the psychological aspect of a psychological contract comes. Can that even be written into a contract? And define for me, Michelle, if you can, what is this psychological contract all about?
Okay, thanks, Jason. Well, firstly, psychological contract is something that is completely subjective. No, it is not written down. No, it is not tangible. No, it is not enforceable. It's built on actions and statements of either party, the employer and the employee, and how these statements and actions are interpreted by either party. It's all about the perceptions of the employee-employer relationship and the views on commitment and what each expects from the other. The thing about the psychological contract, person, is that it is wholly a dynamic thing. It is constantly evolving and it is very responsive to the ebb and flow of the culture of the organization, and that hugely influences people's behavior on a day-to-day basis. So when you think about people's beliefs, ambitions, what each want from each other, it's core to understanding that human component of the employment relationship. So in addition to the legally binding contract, where is the human part of this? Where is the human component? So that would be something that I would, that's how I would describe it. When we look at the psychological contract, people are impacted by senior management, people are impacted by senior HR, but that psychological contract, that deal, people perceive is had with their direct line manager, the person that they see on a weekly or daily basis. That's who they feel contracted to, this subjective contract. And therefore, the key, the underpinning thing here is communication, ongoing communication with employees so that people know where they are, where they stand, and there's no surprises as far as possible.
Some will say to you, there's no room for emotions in this thing called business. We come here to work. We are units of production. And so let's get on with the production. But then they also say to you, but we have a mission statement and we have a statement of values. Would that statement of values now encapsulate what you will term as a psychological contract?
I would say that the statement, mission, vision, and values of an organization is about culture. It more represents the culture of an organization and that culture that the organization puts out there to the public and to its employees. People who are attracted to, gain employment with organizations because of their mission, vision, and culture are attracted to the culture of the organization and would have certain expectations from an organization. So no, I'll push back on that and say, no, vision, mission is about organization culture. The logical contract would sit under that, which again is subjective.
Subjective, it makes it such a gray area. Jonah, you can weigh in on this as well, Joan, because in that gray area, it's how you feel about me and how I perhaps feel about you, how we relate, and can you really legislate, can you really control how two people relate to each other? Joan?
This is why the psychological contract is not a written contract, because of all this variability. Michelle mentioned the dynamism of it. However, that doesn't mean that it diminishes the importance of it, because that psychological contract deals with the humanity piece of it. So if values are important, the individual values as well as the organizational level values as lived out by that supervisor, that line manager. So if fairness is one of my core values as an individual, and I come to work for you, part of the psychological contract, from my perspective, is that we are going to be fair to each other. I'm going to give you a fair day's work, and you are going to compensate me in a manner that is fair. So you may say, but we dealt with that in the legal contract. But when it comes down to living it out on a day to day basis, there's room for discretion. So, for example, you asked me to stay back, and you asked me to stay back for a period just under where I would be entitled to receive overtime or time and a half. Now, for me, I may say, that's not fair because I know tomorrow he's going to ask me to stay back again, and again, he's going to have me leave just before I would be entitled to kick over into overtime pay. So, from my perspective, that's a breach of our psychological contract that we will be fair to each other. Or recently, we spoke about succession planning and the importance of career progression, etc. So if I come in and based on the discussions we had when we were courting, I have an expectation that I'm not going to be stuck in an entry level position for years and years and years, but rather you're going to invest in training and developing me. I'm going to give you my best effort. And through those combined, what I put on the table, what you put on the table, I am likely to benefit from upward mobility. That's part of our psychological contract. And I'm watching not the clock, but the calendar tick over month after month and year after year. And no one is saying anything to me either about training or upward mobility. I would perceive that as a breach in our psychological contract.
That means, Misha, we have to sit down and have the discussion. We have to talk it out. And so a lot of times people in supervisory roles or management roles are weary of having that kind of a discussion because you're going to hold me to it. And you don't want to be held to anything that you may not be able to fairly deliver on. So I'm asking that within the context of how does one in a work environment approach creating that psychological contract?
The thing that springs to mind here is a little bit like a bank account, a psychological or emotional bank account. So when we've talked about, Joan and I both talked about communication and sharing of information. If it is that we have this psychological bank account and we have coffee chats, we have quarterly review conversations, we have social events where we have conversations, we are making deposits into that psychological contract. If it is now that something comes along unexpected and a huge withdrawal has to be made, whether it's that promotion that was implied or whatever, we would hope that when that withdrawal is made, the contract doesn't collapse because there is a balance that we can work on. But like in any situation, people's responses is based on what have I seen happened in the past? Something happened in the past. How was that managed? And that's how the trust is built. So yes, those conversations are scary. And similarly to how a contract protects everybody when the honeymoon phase is over, keeping that communication going in the psychological, in that human space, builds that trust.
The bank account, the deposits and the withdrawals. Now, there comes a time when one party or the other, because it's a combination of at least two,
yes.
When one party seems to be withdrawing far more than they are investing. And so there's a breach, there's a problem. We have a problem. You are using more than you put in. You're taking me now for granted. And so that breach, how does one mend that breach when it occurs in this psychological contract?
Okay, so if we're looking from the employee's perspective, something that was implied or promised is now, it's gone, it's off the table. So for me, I feel there's been a breach, and that's not a good position to be in. Mm-hmm. Balance has been lost, and an individual, an employee will want to either restore a sense of balance or change their expectations. And similar to Joan's example, if it is that I was coming in early, staying late, taking on additional projects on the promise or the implied promise of something come and that's removed, then I will lower my expectations. I'm going to stop all those extra activities and I am going to revert to doing the very basics of my job, nothing more. And that can be seen as something presenteeism. So when we're looking at a breach in contract, obviously, like anything in life, prevention is better than cure. Trying to prevent a breach is better than trying to repair a breach. And again, I cannot emphasize enough the criticality of ongoing communication. Sometimes, despite the best efforts of line managers and managers, things happen. We know the economical climate is so variable. What do we do then? Is it a case of, well, this has happened and this is now off the table, not my fault, nothing I can do with it, let's get on with it? What I would suggest is that at this point in time, you need to speak to your people, renegotiate that contract, discuss it, talk it out. So again, you address people's values, as Joan has said. We look at what are people's expectations, how can they be met. So you need to renegotiate the contract before just getting on with business at hand. But in addition to that, I would say, when we look at breaches are usually change that has come and taken us from off trajectory. So change is the only thing that's constant, and change often shows up in organizations as breaches in psychological contracts. So we need to be looking at, as employees, as organizations, as line managers, how can we better support our people in terms of drawing on their resilience skills when change rears its head and may show up as a breach in a psychological contract.
The psychology of change. But sometimes in that change, Joan, there's a term that's been creeping into our lexicography recently, quiet quitting. I say, all right, you change this contract, I will now just simply do the basics. I will do exactly what it is. So define for us quickly, what is quiet quitting and what does it look like so that we understand what we're facing in the workplace?
All right, so quiet quitting, first of all, has nothing to do with quitting. What happens with quiet quitting is that the employee perceives that there's been a breach in the psychological contract. And so what do they have at their disposal in terms of, putting things back into balance? So if the employer had given a commitment, express or implied, to provide something to the employee, and he or she perceives, I'm not getting this, therefore I will reduce what I'm giving. And Michelle alluded to this. So employee engagement is actually the level of engagement is the willingness on the part of employees to go above and beyond. It's to produce discretionary effort. So you know that you have to do a certain level, perform at a certain level in order not to get fired. So you meet that level. So technically, you are meeting your obligation to the employer. But if you were used to going the extra mile, so you weren't doing the bare minimum, you were doing extra, you perceive there's been a breach in the psychological contract. So you decide, you know what? My legal contract says, I work for you from 9 to 5. I'm out the door at 5:01. And I don't mean 1 minute past, I mean 1 second past, I'm out. So you can't say I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do. But if we had a psychological contract that said I was more flexible before, you may look at me and like, what's up? What's up is that you are not living up to that implied contract, that psychological contract that we had. So I'm going to adjust what I do so that we come back into balance. So quiet quitting is employees saying, okay, I'm going to do what I'm legally required to do. After that, that's my time. And it's something that has come about, particularly since the pandemic, when we had remote working and the boundaries got blurred, if not obliterated. So you were doing work from home, you were doing work at all sorts of strange hours, things were being asked of you. And because we were in a crisis situation, employees would have adjusted and gone the extra mile. Now they're saying, okay, I'm reeling this back in, right? Because I have found that I need to have a quality of life that if I continue to go the extra mile, I'm not going to be able to have. Or we've laid off people, the work has not gone down. So you're asking me to do more and you haven't said anything to me about how you're going to compensate me for that. So I'm going back to the bare minimum. And that's what quiet quitting is about. It's an unfortunate term because it's somewhat pejorative. It
Yes.
gives the impression that the employee is somehow in the wrong, but it's not necessarily so. It's sometimes a search for equity. It's sometimes a search for quality of life, having an integration between your work life and your personal life and your family obligations. So again, it comes back to the communication, right? As in relationships, it's fundamental. Open communication that flows in both directions, that has that feedback mechanism so that we create shared meaning and understanding so that you don't need to think that I'm quiet quitting and I don't need to think that you are quiet firing me.
Indeed so. We have to leave it there, ladies, but what an interesting discussion indeed. Looking at employment contracts, I think we understand the legal a lot better now, but we can also now better understand the psychological, which is also a critical part of how we operate within the workplace. If you don't already have that within your consciousness, employers and managers and supervisors, I'd just like to commend you to start it today. Start thinking very seriously about it and addressing it. HRMAB is possible for you. Remember, membership comes with benefits. You can go to the website hrmab.org.bb and get to know more. You can join and become a member, and these ladies will be happy to assist you as you go forward. Thank you so much, President of HRMAB, my friend Joan Underwood, Michelle Lewis-Downer, business psychologist, for joining us this morning and exciting us on this subject of employment contracts, legal and psychological. Thank you.
Thank you, Pearson. Good morning.
You're very welcome.
Morning, morning, morning.